I'm Julia Forgy, and I'm a second-year law student at Stanford. It's my honor to serve as the moderator for the first panel of this symposium. I'm joined today by scholars from around the world who will discuss the dynamic management of global fisheries in a changing climate. Specifically, the panelists will explore social ecological aspects of fisheries, what distinguishes dynamic from static management, and the challenges of dynamic management and conservation in the face of climate change and quote-unquote bad economics. I will first briefly introduce our four panelists, and then each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer. And once all the panelists have presented, I will open the floor to questions from the audience, and among the panelists, the questions can be general and addressed to all panelists. And then we'll break for lunch out in the courtyard. Our first speaker is Natalie Bonn. She's an assistant professor at the University of Victoria's School of Environmental Studies in British Columbia, Canada. She has a background in resource management and environmental studies, and most recently spent 4 years in tropical North Queensland performing postdoctoral work at the Australian Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at James Cook University. Today, Natalie will use the social-ecological systems framework to provide examples of ecological, social, and governance characteristics that may influence fisheries management outcomes. Our second presenter, Daniel Dunn, is a graduate student in Duke University's Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab, where he focuses on ecosystem-based fisheries management, pelagic conservation, and marine spatial planning in a changing ocean. Daniel sits on the scientific steering committee of the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative and is the lead of its Dynamic Pelagic Working Group. Today, Daniel will discuss what differentiates dynamic from static management measures, illustrating the diverse definitions of dynamic with the example of move-on rules. Our third presenter, Allstair Hobday, is a principal research scientist at Australia's Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, Marine and Atmospheric Research, where he leads the marine climate impacts and adaptation research and is co-chair of the International Climate Impacts on Top Ocean Predators program. His research focuses on investigating the impacts of climate change on marine resources and developing adaptation options to underpin sustainable use into the future. Today, Allstair will examine the role of dynamic ocean management of marine resources in a changing climate using Australia as a case study. And finally, Rashid Sumalla is a professor and director of the Fisheries Economics Research Unit at the University of British Columbia's Fisheries Center, where he specializes in bioeconomics, marine ecosystem valuation, and the analysis of global issues such as fisheries subsidies, illegal fishing, and the economics of high and deep seas fisheries. He also studies how emerging threats to the ocean, such as climate change and oil spills, are likely to impact the economics of fisheries worldwide. Today, Rashid will address the impacts of bad economics on fisheries management and conservation under climate change. With that, I will turn it over to our panelists, beginning with Natalie Bonn.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to open up this first panel, although I must admit, a little bit intimidated to be the first speaker after Jane Lubchenco. Let me move this down. So what I thought I would do today is discuss fisheries, or start off with the way that I often think about fisheries, which is as dynamic social ecological systems. And my main purpose in this presentation is to illustrate why I think about them in this way, to provide you a case study or an example to illustrate this, and then to highlight two collaborative projects that I'm involved with that are attempting to use the social ecological systems framework to get at solutions in fisheries management and marine conservation. Now, it can be somewhat depressing to work in the marine environment because we hear of many of these disaster stories, collapsing fisheries, climate change, etc. But I think instead I prefer to look forward and towards solutions. So I think the key question that fisheries are facing in a dynamic world is how can we manage fisheries successfully to both ensure that future generations can continue to eat and enjoy the seafood that we currently have the privilege of doing, and also that marine systems can thrive either by being rehabilitated or continue to thrive. In my mind, I see this idea of thinking about fisheries as both having social aspects and being based in ecological systems as really bringing these kinds of ideas about solutions together. So I wanted to mention a bit about one of the places where I'm doing work that really highlights this interconnected nature of the ecology and the social systems. So I want to take you to my home province of British Columbia in Canada on the west coast, north of here. This is a temperate marine system that is very dynamic. It's known to have decadal oscillation, the Pacific decadal oscillations, of a somewhat cyclical nature where the system, the species composition can change over these cycles. It's also a system that's very rich in various marine resources, although there have been declines in recent years. But what's particularly interesting here, as in many other parts of the world, is that we have cultures from the indigenous people that are very intricately tied to the marine system. In Canada, we call these First Nations, the indigenous people. And in this case, they, certainly before European contact, were almost wholly reliant on marine resources for their main subsistence, trade, social, and cultural needs. And to a large extent, that's still the case today because many of these communities are quite remote. Here's one example of a community called Hartley Bay, where there's no road access, so it's only sea or air access. This means that there aren't any grocery stores, and even though people do bring in food from elsewhere, they're still, for most of the nutritional needs, very much reliant on the marine resources. However, at the same time, there's been less and less access, or the ability to access these resources has been rather limited. This is often resulting then in health effects by coastal communities where diseases such as diabetes, obesity, heart disease are much more prevalent than certainly they used to be. And while the ecological system has been dynamic in the past, many of the declines that we've been seeing in recent years are certainly outside of the range of natural variation that used to be the case. And thus you can see this link between the ecological system and the cultural and health of human communities, where these are in danger partially because the ecosystem is changing. What's happening in recent years is that there's a resurgence of interest by these indigenous groups to manage proactively their resources. And the sign of one of the First Nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island illustrates this quite well. They say here that they're owners for 10,000 years and stewards again after 150 years. I'm working in part of the British Columbia coast, starting recently after I moved back to British Columbia, where one of the coalition of First Nations, the Central Coast First Nations, have approached myself and my colleague Anne Solomon at Simon Fraser University to do some work with them. They've been working on developing what they're calling a marine use plan in this region, and they have now drafted a plan for the central coast of British Columbia. They've asked myself and Anne to do an assessment of this draft plan that they have currently have. And what we're doing is partially thinking about the social and ecological tie of these marine systems in doing so. So essentially what we've been asked to do and what we're doing is focus on the ecology, and in this case it's more the kinds of recommendations and guidelines of design principles to have ecologically effective marine protected area networks as well as spatial components of fisheries management. In their marine use plan, they have some conservation components that they're proposing, conservation zones, which are the ones that we're assessing in that regard. But at the same time, we're also just as interested in the kinds of governance and management mechanisms that are more likely to lead towards effective management. So just as we've done for the ecological side of things, we're also reviewing the international literature on guidelines of good practices for governance and management. So bringing in together both the ecological effectiveness as well as governance effectiveness. And that's why I find this idea of a social ecological system and framework so appealing. Some of the framing of this idea originated with Elinor Ostrom and is depicted here in the way that it's shown in her science paper in 2009. Really what this is saying is that we can think about these systems as being comprised of both ecosystems, here called resource systems, which might be a particular marine ecosystem, and resource units, which might be a fishery that's being managed within that. At the same time, there's the broader social system, which includes the people that use that marine environment and the way that they're managing it, the kinds of rules and institutions that are in place, which is the governance system. The point here isn't that we should think about all these separate components, but rather that different combinations of these interact to create certain outcomes in marine systems. And these outcomes could be a sustainable fishery that coincides with healthy human communities, or you could see the opposite of social ecological poverty traps, whereby people rely on food for their subsistence. Fisheries have been depleted. They can't stop fishing because they need to eat, so they fish harder, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm quite attracted to this idea of social ecological systems, and I'm involved in 2 projects that have been attempting to use this framework in a more concrete way. And I'd like to mention these briefly. These are both collaborative projects that I'm a part of, and they're attempting to use aspects of this particular framework. The first one is asking what influences whether a transformation towards marine ecosystem-based management occurs. What we mean here by transformation is that from one mode of governance or management, things move to another mode. For example, you might have no management or only single species management, then changing to be much more integrative, considering both the ecology and the social systems, and aiming towards sustainable fisheries and healthy human communities. You could also call this stewardship, which is the way it's often referred to as well. So this is a project that's being led by Per Olsen and Henrik Osterblom at Stockholm Resilience Center, and 12 others, myself included. What we've done here is pick 12 examples of marine social ecological systems that the participants here are either involved in closely or know very well. And the approach we've taken is to choose a few variables from the social ecological systems framework, in our case related to learning, linkages, communications. I'll explain a little bit later. Then we've coded these particular variables and also the outcomes that we're seeing in these 12 cases. And the outcomes range from having a few policies in place but no implementation yet, to the highest level would be having full stewardship of the social and ecological system managed in an adaptive way. None of the cases have reached that full stewardship level, but we have some that are getting a bit closer. This is a work in progress, but some preliminary conclusions that we're starting to draw from the data that we've gathered is that the systems that are seeing these higher order outcomes, or that are starting to move towards marine ecosystem-based management, they all have some form of experimentation. So this might be pilot studies, or in some cases it might be academics partnering with fishing communities to test different management measures, such as spatial closures, as was the case in the loco fishery in Chile. They also all have brokers or people who link across stakeholder groups. So what you're potentially seeing is increased communications among these stakeholder groups that in other cases might be quite separate. And perhaps because of this increased communication, there might be more willingness to work together to reach common solutions. And in addition, we've seen that we have both social and environmental mobilizers that are always present in these systems. And again, these are people that coalesce their particular constituencies to be engaged. So what we might be able to say here is that perhaps these examples are necessary but not sufficient conditions in moving towards ecosystem-based management. Now, this is one example of using the social ecological systems framework to pick a few variables to examine in more detail. but it's not really taking advantage of the full integrated social and ecological component. In particular here, we're focusing more on some characteristics of the users involved in the system and the governance system. So the next project I wanted to mention is one that's trying to be more structured in using the social ecological systems framework. And this is really in trying to implement it and operationalize it, because so far it's been very conceptually interesting, but difficult to actually implement because there are so many potential ways of doing so. So this group of us has called ourselves the Social-Ecological Systems Meta-Analysis Database Project. Just in case you need another acronym, here's another one for your toolbox. And it's being led by Michael Cox at Dartmouth College and Mike Schoon at Arizona State University. And it's a project that's comprised of primarily early career researchers from all over the world. Our ultimate goal is to identify characteristics of successful large-scale governance, fisheries and marine systems included. We focus here on large-scale governance because a lot of the work that led up to developing the social ecological systems framework originated out of small-scale studies, so individual communities managing their fisheries or implementing marine protected areas, and the characteristics of those communities in why some of them tend to self-organize to do management, whereas others don't. So here we're interested in the opposite extreme. Many of our environmental issues, especially fisheries and marine issues, actually take place at large scales. So what are some of the characteristics of cases that do more successful management compared to others? We're operationalizing this by building a database, relational database, that has about 200 different variables in it that try to pick what we think are the key variables from these different parts of a social ecological system. And then the idea is to use those to select variables for testing specific hypotheses. We've developed the database to date and have tested it with 5 sample case studies, including a fisheries management case and a marine protected area case. We picked these 5 because they range very broadly in terms of the kinds of large-scale management questions that we're faced with in the world. So what we've done so far is analyze each of these 5 cases in terms of snapshots or time periods. So for each, there's a distinct time period where the management and governance of the system has changed, and that allows us to progress whether or not some of these management efforts have an effect or not on the resources being managed. There's a special issue in progress that's reporting out on some of those. But the next step is to do more than just these 5 cases, obviously. So we're hoping to do this by stratifying some sectors. So for example, we're aiming to have between 10 and 20 fisheries management cases at large scale so that we can start to draw conclusions about the kinds of characteristics that the more successful cases have, and the same thing, that the ones that align those that are less successful, and see whether we can draw conclusions about what might be improvements in management into the future. Ultimately, we hope to do a meta-analysis of all the cases, fisheries, land-based, pollution, et cetera, and see whether there's any commonalities among general large-scale governance. And eventually, we hope to make this open source so that everyone can use the database to ask their own questions, but also to add their own data from cases that they know well. So just to sum up, these are what I was hoping to show you today is an example of the way that social and ecological linkages occur in fisheries systems and in other marine systems. I'm involved in some ongoing work that tries to understand what works, what doesn't in fisheries management and in marine conservation. And what I find quite appealing about this approach, the social ecological systems approach, is that it's moving away from simply identifying some of the train wrecks that we all know too well and looking forward to identify solutions and learning lessons from some of those failures that we do know about. Thank you very much. So I think there might be time for questions for clarification, and then it moves on to the next. Is that correct?
Good morning, Natalie. I'm Kai Lee from the Packard Foundation. I thought your list of initial variables of communities undergoing a transition toward ecosystem-based management was very interesting. And I wonder if you have an opinion about whether experimentation, ability to link across stakeholder groups, and the presence of social and environmental mobilizers, whether those are things that can be brought in from outside of a community, or must these arise locally in some sense, and how do you make them self-sustaining over time? I realize these are ambitious questions, but I wondered if you had an opinion.
Yeah, we can certainly talk more about that. My sense is that these people and the way that the communication works needs to be accepted by the communities, but they're not always originating from within the communities. So I think parachuting in, as they say, somebody to do a task without having the trust of the people involved is probably not likely to play that same role as what we've seen here. But then having people who already know the communities, who work within them, who might not originally be from there, but some of those people can effectively serve in those roles. So we've seen a bit of both in these case studies that we're examining. And I think it's a really good question, because one of the obvious questions following on from this is, well, if these kinds of characteristics seem to be present in the more effective cases, then how can we have those characteristics present in cases that currently don't have them, so that we can move towards more effective management in those other cases? And I think that's exactly the question. You could have somebody come in and build capacity within communities to create leaders within the community. That might be one way of engaging local people in those kinds of roles. Or you could attempt to have somebody from outside serve the roles, but I think they'd need to have a strong tie within the communities in some way.
Actually, Sarah Maxwell, Stanford University. My question actually follows very closely on with that. And I was curious if you could give some examples of like who these mobilizers are, like at least maybe in a marine context. I know it sounds like you're looking across terrestrial and marine, but do they tend to be government individuals? Are they resource users who just step up to be leaders? Or
it actually varies quite a lot. So one of the examples that's pretty well known is the case of Chile, the local fisheries, which is a traditional user rights system that's become spread all over the country, but it originated initially with some academics in the community that had ties to some of the fishing communities, thinking about, well, the management of the loco isn't currently working, so let's try something different. In the marine stations of the universities, they decided to do spatial closures to see what would happen. And that was very successful. Other communities adopted it. The communities themselves were communicating with one another quite a lot, fishermen to fishermen, talking about the effectiveness of these that particular example. And then, it spread from one community to the other, with a lot of them now having that kind of closure in place. But it does vary a lot, and I think one of the points of this kind of research too is that there are no panaceas per se, that these many different contexts are likely to lead to slightly different combinations of interacting variables that require somewhat different needs for solutions. And the hope for having a lot of different kinds of cases is that we might be able to find enough that are similar to one another that we can start to generalize about the sorts of things that do and don't work.
Thank you.
Last question.
Hi, Katie Cito from Berkeley. I was really interested in how you were saying that your research and the research of this group is more trying to apply to larger systems, because I know that according to Ostrom and a lot of people, one of the challenges with the SES framework is the scaling up idea. And I was curious if you could say a little bit more about how the group is doing that. You opened with the story of the Haida, and I wondered if you're trying to actually do some scaling from smaller systems, or if the meta-analysis is just relegated to larger systems, or how you're doing that.
So for now, that particular project is focusing on gathering data for just larger scale systems so that we can then compare them to the findings from small scale systems. Now, it's somewhat an arbitrary definition, and initially Le Nostrum was one of the advisors on this project, and about half of the people that are involved in that scaling project are former PhD students of Le Nostrum's. So it's a group of people that's quite connected to her thinking around these issues and some of the work that had been done at small scales. So there's a lot of people involved in small scale studies already. So we figure on top of that, let's look at these larger scale studies to see whether or not there are some commonalities. So initially, it's a data gathering or collating data, both from the literature and through expert interviews for people involved in large-scale cases, so that we can start to build a bit of a database on the kinds of things that might be important. Now, as I said, we're starting to expand from just the initial building of the database and testing of it to trying to gather more cases. So if I know that I've talked to one of you in here who's quite interested in applying this framework to a particular case. And if there are other people who have cases who think that they would be well suited to applying in this context, then come talk to me as well, because I'd be interested in seeing whether we can build that into our work here as well. So thank you very much.
So maybe I can start out while the presentation is being moved over by saying that as a good ecologist, everything, you try to look at everything at scales, and whereas Natalie was honored and maybe a little intimidated by her preceding speaker, I am completely honored and intimidated by the panel that I'm working with here, much less Dr. Lubchenco. So I'm extremely excited to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity. The only saving grace for me is that I'm going to talk about something completely different than the last two speakers, so you won't be able to compare the talks exactly. So today I'm going to talk about two things that are connected: move-on rules and the diverse definition of dynamic management. I'm going to start with the definition of dynamic management and then move on to move-on rules as an example of that. And it's important that I specify that I'm really not just here for myself, but I'm here for the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab, and in particular for my boss and advisor, Pat Halpin. And Pat and Andre Busani have both been integral in pretty much everything that you're going to see here. So I want to start by throwing up an animation, because if we're talking about a dynamic ocean, it's pretty integral to actually watch it move a little bit. And in this case, hopefully what you can see here is on the left, sea surface temperature anomalies. That's change from the mean of sea surface temperature. And on the right, change in sea surface height for the entire Pacific Ocean. And what you immediately get the idea that not just on small scales, but on very large scales, the ocean is incredibly dynamic. You see some pretty incredible features in here. This is actually an El Nino event, so you see sloshing back and forth along the equator. It stopped. Play it one more time. So you're going to see sloshing back and forth across the equator. And you're also going to see some eddies that are formed over here that sort of move across these guys are mesoscale eddies moving across. You have the transition chlorophyll front zone up here. Lots of different things that are moving back and forth. So it's pretty obvious just by looking at figures like this that the ocean is incredibly dynamic. But the question is, not just that the ocean is dynamic, but if it's dynamic, how do we manage it in a dynamic fashion? And that's, I think, the task that we have set before us for the next couple of days as we contemplate this issue. And I think to try to illustrate what we might mean by it, I'm going to throw up some examples so we can, strawmen, so we can knock them down. And the first one is, again, based on scale. If dynamism is entirely based on scale, and if you look at this from a decadal scale, is just fisheries management itself dynamic if you're using quotas, right? So you change the quota according to how biomass trends throughout the years, and if you're changing that once a year over a decade, is that dynamic management? Or even within a year, if you have a set quota, but the date for when you're going to close the fishery is indeterminate, and you're just moving forward until you hit that quota, and then you close it at that particular date, or at that indeterminate date, does that qualify as dynamic management? Finally, this is an example from the New England groundfish fishery, where they have rolling closures to protect cod spawning. And these are closures that are known beforehand, their location and the size, but they move. Every month they're in a different place, even though those are predetermined. So is that sort of predetermined management? Would that be considered dynamic management? I think it's also important to try to think about the concept of dynamic management within the framework of other management frameworks that have been put forward. Specifically, the adaptive management framework. This is just one example of millions of versions of this that you can find online. This one is courtesy of the Department of Interior. And so in thinking about what is dynamic management, I think it's useful to sort of take a look at a framework like this and say, where would it fit within this? Is it pretty much the same thing? Are we just changing one title for another title? Or is there some difference between the two? And since you all paid my way to come out here, I think it's important that I not just throw questions at you, but that we actually start to try to get at some of this and postulate. So I'm going to postulate that for us in the marine geospatial ecology world, that dynamic management for us is literally at the implementation stage, that the implementation of any management effort is done according to or in reference to spatiotemporally variable conditions. So specifically, I'm going to throw out a draft definition, and this is from the perspective of a marine spatial ecologist, that dynamic ocean management is any coordination of activities related to the marine environment in which the time or location of the implemented measure is dependent on spatially temporally variable conditions, such as oceanography, the contents of a hull in a fishery, or market signals. And one little caveat on the end there that says, and has the possibility to occur more than once a year. That last little bit is important because without it, you could still qualify the first two examples I gave as dynamic management. And I don't think most people here would want those examples included in the definition. So if you include the last bit about having the possibility of happening more than once a year, you remove those first two options. But the third one there still is feasible within the realm of what I might consider dynamic management. So I want to go on in the second part of this talk to offer a specific example that we've been working on, and that is move-on rules. So we have been looking at, so a move-on rule is the targeted temporary closure of an area triggered by the contents of a hull. So when the contents of a hull, for example, if you haul a bunch of cod and you realize you have one adult cod and a lot of juvenile cod, move-on rules would suggest or regulate that you have to move some distance in time and some distance in space away from where you caught the juvenile cod so that you could avoid catching them again. These types of management measures are actually in place in many fisheries across the world. I actually learned about a couple new ones last week, so not just in the Northern Hemisphere and in New Zealand and Australia, but also in the Chilean hake fishery, and there's a Russian pollock fishery as well that uses these. And they use them generally to try to reduce bycatch or discards of juveniles. The problem with them is that they are not really empirically informed. They tend to be driven by negotiation between management and fishermen, which is incredibly important, but they're not actually informed by data-driven analyses of the correlation between these events in time and space. So what we wanted to try to do was to take a look to see if you could actually inform such move-on rules with spatial temporal autocorrelation analyses. And so we're working directly with the sector in the New England groundfish fishery. It's the Georges Bank fixed gear sector and the Cape Cod Commercial Hook Fishermen's Association, who are generally at the forefront of trying to, at least within the Northeast U.S., at the forefront of trying to implement some new measures and be more conservative. So they're mostly fishing with hook and line gear and really sink gill nets. They fish for cod, flounder, monkfish, and skates. And they're specific things that they're trying to avoid. And this is sort of stems slightly from the idea of that Dr. Luchenko brought up earlier about incentives. The fishermen are incentivized to avoid depredation events, which is events where spiny dogfish or hagfish eat the contents of their net, or the catch of juveniles, catch of choke stocks, which are stocks that they have a low quota for, or nuisance species that they just want to avoid in general. And the reason is that those, in each of those cases, except for the nuisance species, that catch is counted against their quota in some way. So even if the catch of their gillnet is eaten by dogfish, the observer on board would count the remains and try to estimate how many cod were actually still in the net, and they get charged for that. So they want to avoid that type of event. So they're highly incentivized to try to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen twice. So that's essentially what we're looking at. If you know that these events are not just co-located in space, but also in time, you begin to think, okay, there's some clustering there that we might be able to use to inform rules as to how far they should move away in time or space to avoid these events. And you can come up with some kind of specific distance, hopefully. So we went forward with this. We used some methods that I'm not going to go into here because I think it would bore most people to tears, but I'm happy to talk to you about them. And essentially what we came up with in the end is this heat map of the sort of autocorrelation over distance and time. So autocorrelation is just the correlation of events over distance or time. And what you see is the level of autocorrelation, and you can also find the peaks in the autocorrelation, and our interest was in trying to see if those peaks in autocorrelation could be used to actually come up with the move-on rule. And we found that, in fact, they can, and they're pretty effective. I want to take a little bit of time on this table because there's some results there that I think illustrate exactly how useful a measure this can be. So the first one is, let me just try to explain this to begin with. The rate inside is actually the rate within the move-on rule, the rate of catch of further events happening within the number of events that are captured within the move-on rule, or the rate of the events within the move-on rule, as opposed to the rate outside of the move-on rule. So the higher the rate inside the move-on rule, the better. The lower the rate outside the move-on rule, the better. And then there's finally the actual the total reduction in that type of event that happened. So the first thing that jumps out is that for fleas, which are tiny amphipods that absolutely destroy the contents of their catch, that 90% of the sets within the move-on rule also had flea'd catch. So it's pretty clear that if you have an event like this and you don't move beyond this distance, you're going to have the same kind of event again. Similarly, with hagfish, had these rules been in place, they would have been able to reduce the number of hagfish events by over 50%. And it's important to note that in this analysis, the events that did not have any kind of bycatch within the move-on rules, you don't have to just simply say, oh, the fishermen didn't get to fish that day. It's simply that they're fishing in another location. So across the board, we found that for choke species, you could come up with reductions in the event rate of more than 25%. For juveniles, approximately a third of reduction. And for depredation events, close to 50% reduction in these types of events. So just to conclude, I think it's important to clarify what we mean by dynamic management. That's I think the point of our discussion today and over the next couple of days. And I think you've already seen, and you will see very quickly, that there are a wide variety of speakers here. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity. And I think the one definition I threw up there is going to be one of 15 probably today that gets put up there. And I'm excited to see what the rest of them are and to see how we can sort of try to bring them together. Second, I think it's really important that as we move forward with trying to identify what dynamic management is, that we put it within the other frameworks that are already out there, like adaptive management. And I think that's possible and informative. And finally, that dynamic management can be driven by a wide assortment of spatiotemporally variable conditions. I just gave you one example, which was the move-on rules, which is based on the contents of catch. But I think that this type of dynamic management you can see from a cultural perspective. We would be able to see from an economic perspective using market conditions, as well as the oceanographic conditions that maybe we'll see from Allstair in a minute. So that's it. Thank you very much. Sarah's coming to save me with a question.
Hi, Daniel. That was awesome. I was just curious if you're doing any any on the ground sort of ground truthing of whether or not that works with the actual fishermen.
Right. So we were working directly with a fishing sector. It was funded by NIMS, but these aren't regulations. They're sort of guidelines that we're trying to feed into the sector. And there is no immediate effort funded to actually to watch people and see what they do. I think what I've been trying to talk up to the social scientists that this would be a really interesting project to actually see how that information was transferred throughout the fishery. Because what we sort of suspect may happen is that this information has been presented to the fishermen. A couple fishermen may decide to attempt to use this information, and then depending on what their catch looks like, it may expand on throughout the fishery. So I think it'd be a very curious study to see how it does go throughout that information does progress.
Cool. I have a million other questions, but I'll pester you later.
Thanks.
Hi, Daniel. I was really interested in this move-on concept. I wasn't familiar with it, but I noticed on your temporal or your autocorrelation graph, it seemed like the spatial variability was much lower than the temporal variability, I think. I was wondering, maybe just I'll finish a comment. What do you think in terms of the spatial persistence of some of these events versus the temporal persistence? And if we're talking about those types of dynamic directions,
sure.
Could you discuss
that's
the
a great question. So I think you're right. Actually, most of the move-on rules that we came up with, or that we discovered, on the temporal side, they ranged from 1 to 6 days or so, and on the spatial side, they ranged from 2 to maybe 6 kilometers. So I don't know that you can compare those scales per se, but there is a huge question as to how that pertains to the actual ecology of the species, and there is evidence that the ability of some of these species to move is limiting them, and that's why you're getting the spatial component of it, and that you may see more temporal persistence in the particular events. We didn't actually find that. Things like the amphipods, which we would assume aren't necessarily moving over great distances and should have been located in one space for longer periods of time, they seem to be as ephemeral as dogfish, which can clearly move throughout this range quite quickly. And even things like hagfish, which I think a lot of people assume are very evenly distributed throughout the range, that's not what we were finding with the results in the correlation, and it's not what we were finding with the results in terms of the actual reduction in the rates when we did the validation. But yeah, there's a lot of effort that needs to be done to try to not just do these autocorrelation analyses, but then to try to feed this back into the life history of the different species. And the ecologists in the room won't be surprised to find out that the life history of some of these species is really not well known at all. I think we think we know what it is, but particularly for hagfish, they don't really know. And amphipods, they have no idea. Okay. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to say that in addition to the work that I'll present today, where I've been the driver behind it, I'm really strongly supported by 2 co-authors in Tasmania, curiously enough, one from a law school as well. I work for CSIRO, we're Australia's federal science agency. It's a bit like NOAA is in the US. However, we have groups that not only do marine, but do radio telescopes and industry stuff and light metals and so on. And I'm based in the city of Hobart, which is in Tasmania. Importantly, which I'll return to later in the talk, we're on the southeast edge of what's called a global warming hotspot. This is a place where the ocean is warming really rapidly, and so we're seeing dramatic shifts in species and where they're occurring. And that's going to be really important with how we approach ocean management, because static management is not going to work in a place where the ocean is changing really rapidly. So I'll give you one example of where I've come from with spatial management, and that's been with a really valuable species called southern bluefin tuna. That's a quota-managed fishery in Australia. You have to own quota to be able to catch it. And this species moves a lot around southern Australia, as that figure shows you there, with just arrows going everywhere. And that means that in some areas, when you hold quota, you're able to catch the fish. However, it sometimes shows up in other areas where the fishermen don't hold quota. And if they catch that animal, they're not allowed to sell it. And so it's throwing a dead fish back overboard. And that's a pretty poor use of ocean resources. So the system that I've been involved in is trying to work out, well, how would we actually regulate access to a species that's moving great distances and do that in a way that it still makes the fishery economically viable, and the fishermen are able to catch other species that are valuable. So this is the east coast of Australia, and you can see the East Australia current which flows south there. Actually, the global warming hotspot is because that current carries warm water down the coast, and it's speeding up and carrying more hot water, and atmospheric heating is also doubling that effect there. So the solution we came up with was this dynamic spatial management approach, and we electronically tag a fish. When you recover that tag, it tells you information about the temperature that the fish experienced. On the basis of that temperature, you construct its habitat preference, and that's what that frequency distribution shows in blue there. That's at the surface what kind of temperatures the animal looks for. At different depths in the ocean, it has different types of those profiles. And when you stack them all up together, you can get this 3D habitat preference for the animal. You can then marry that historical information with a real-time ocean model and say, where in the ocean today is that habitat found? And that's what we produced, that last habitat prediction. And the brown colour is where the fish likes to be, and the green colour is where it doesn't like to be. We give that information to managers, and they make a decision about where they want to put lines on the water. And they do that every 2 weeks. So this fits the definition that Daniel gave us, that this dynamic management is responding to ocean conditions and doing it many times during a particular season. And so the management agency then issues this advice to the fishers, and they have 1 day to respond and get into the new management zones. If you don't hold quota, you've got to get out of the spot that might become closed. So during a season, you can see that it reflects to some degree what you think ocean conditions might look like. It's a bit more complicated than just straight lines on the water. And interestingly, over time, we've been doing this for 10 years, the first year the managers put straight lines on the water. They thought it would confuse fishermen if there were curved lines on the water. And over time, they realised actually fishermen are very sophisticated with the kind of position-finding equipment they have. And we've done a very nice analysis to show that complexity of this management in terms of how the lines are drawn has increased over time. And fishermen like that because they're not being penalised for areas where the fish aren't occurring. And so this dynamic management actually offers you an area savings. And I've just got the simulation through a season of the green areas where the fish don't like to be, and you'll see the brown area kind of intrudes to the north. So if you look at that over a long period of time, which I'll just show you in this time series here, that's this north-south movement of the boundary between the red and the green. That's moving up and down, up and down, up and down. And if you weren't going to do spatial management, you would have to pick an average location and draw a straight line. This is how far north or south you are corresponding to this east coast of Australia. And you can see that if you drew the line, say through the top part of that, you would be on this bit of the curve. You would only be protecting an area where fish were about 30% of the time. So you're wasting 70% of your management in that area because the fish aren't there. So that, along the coastline, that's 200 kilometres of area that would be being restricted for fisheries access, where the thing that you're trying to protect doesn't live there. And as you can see, as you come down that curve there, there's about the 50% line, and that's a distance of about 400 kilometres. So this is an area about the length of California over which this species is moving. So having dynamic management is a real advantage in this area. So then what would climate change do to this kind of dynamic management system? And this plot you'll be familiar with perhaps from IPCC, which shows under climate change, the distribution of temperature is going to shift and things will generally become warmer. But that's not the only thing that can happen. In fact, you can have several kinds of shifts, and I'll show you what that means. So if your idea was you're going to protect a bit of habitat with an MPA and the climate shifts a little bit and becomes warmer, to keep protecting that same area in the ocean, you need to now move your protected area to the south, to the north, to the east or west, wherever you are. You just have to put the same area in a different place. But under climate change, we're not only going to change the mean, we're going to change the variance. And so this second plot here shows the historical conditions as the smaller bell curve, as the tighter bell curve. And then with climate change, you're going to basically spread conditions so you're going to get more extremes. And that means that if you're doing static management, you need much bigger areas. The area of between 20 and 25 degrees of water is now found over a much bigger area than it used to be. So that smearing, again, means that dynamic management will be really important. And if you stack both a change in the mean and a change in the variance together, you need to do your management on a larger area and in a different place if you're going to keep protecting the same species. So long-term marine protected area planning, where you set these things up for 20 or 50 years, you're not going to be protecting the area that you thought you were as climate change moves the ocean around. So what's the benefit then of doing dynamic management? And I'll call the benefit the area savings that you have. So currently at the moment, if you do static management, you penalise people because you protect an area sometimes where things aren't in an ocean that moves around. So we have a benefit by going to dynamic management. Under climate change, you'll probably get the same benefit if only the mean changes. You just need to put your area somewhere else, and if you're doing dynamic management in that place, the area savings should be the same. But if we have this idea that there's an increase in variance in how the ocean is responding, in fact, you'll need a much bigger static area. The dynamic management should be about the same in terms of its effectiveness, but your savings is even greater. So in future, I'd say that there'll be even more incentive to do dynamic management because of how the ocean is going to be changing. And I can't seem to quite get my head around this last case of where you change the mean and the variance, and maybe the panel in our discussions will think about this one. If you had both changes in mean and variance, does that benefit, is it just the same as when you had the variance, or does the benefit get a little bit bigger or smaller? And I think simulation is the way to get around that question. So where in the world then would we need to look at doing these spatial management approaches like I showed you in Eastern Australia? Either where there's an increase in mean, where there's an increase in variability, or where we might see them both together. So if I look at the historical trend in sea surface temperature, and this plot shows the average rate of warming over, say, a 100-year period, and you can recognise red spots on that map, and these are what we call global warming hotspots. So the one I showed you before was Eastern Australia, but that's not the strongest one. If we filter that data and I show you where they are, here are about 25 or so hotspots around the world where the temperature is changing very rapidly. If you're doing static management in any of those areas, your reserve is not going to be in the right place when species move. So those are places where you should look at adjusting things there. If you look at where historical sea surface temperature variability is, this is where the ocean has really big differences, say, between summer and winter. You can see icebound areas, you can see areas where the currents change quite dramatically. And those are places, if I just filter those and let's look at the 10% of the ocean where that happens most, that's where you should look at thinking about dynamic management will become even more important. So, the whole eastern seaboard of the US is an area where variability is going to be changing. And so that's a spot where, again, spatial management that can be dynamic might be really important. To get Australia back in the mix, I have to drop my threshold to about 20% of the fastest changing areas. So I'll do that when I present this in Australia. If you overlay those two things together, and I've just overlaid those contours, you can see where you have those two things coinciding is the brown colour there. And so these are places where you're getting this double effect of likely get a change in the mean and a change in the variance over time. And again, these should be places where we've got to be looking and see if the policy or the management arrangements are good and could handle this dynamic approach. In future, if I stack up, for example, global change models, one on top of themselves, and ask where are the fastest warming areas, the colours in this map indicate where there's agreement that there's going to be a fast warming area. So where it's red, all 6 models of the future agree that's going to be a fast warming area. Where it's a lighter blue colour, there's disagreement between models. So in general, the places where it's warming very quickly today are the places where it's going to be warming and changing in future. And again, this gives us some confidence that if we start doing that dynamic management in the places based on the historical signal, that's also where we can do it based on the future projections. So the main point out of that first part is that dynamic management is being used now with the group that will talk to you this weekend. There'll be some really, really good examples of where it's happening around the world. The main advantage is that it's an area savings, and stakeholders really like that. Instead of closing off a big area, you're giving them opportunities to continue their activities in that. And so it's a good process of dialogue that comes out for that. And the second point is that under climate change, these spatial management approaches will be really more important. And particularly that last point is what I'd thought that this workshop would focus on. If we're going to look at doing this dynamic management, what are the policy and management tools you need to do to support it? And I'll just test then, so how would Australia's Marine Protected Area Network, which was set up to kind of protect our marine space, cope with climate change? Now, it wasn't explicitly designed to do that, but policymakers are saying now we've got 30% of the coastline protected, we've pretty much got climate change covered. By chance, they could be right, but let's look at 3 metrics that will illustrate whether or not they are. The first one is that in Australia, the main axis of climate change is pushing things further south. So if your marine protected area is long and skinny, the climate can move through that marine protected area. If it's short and fat, the climate signal pushes the environment through that very quickly. So my first metric is, did they orientate things north-south or east-west? The second one is that will they retain the environment inside that protected area in future? And the third one I'll skip today. So here's the first one with orientation. And just look at the top left map. If it's coloured in blue, its dominant axis is north-south. And so that's giving the longest period of time that the climate can move through that space. And the red is where they're predominantly east or west. And in general, about 54% of them are orientated north-south and the remainder are east-west. So that was like tossing a coin. So on the basis of how they've been designed on that first metric, you'd say, yeah, it's about what you'd expect if you did things randomly. The second one is how much habitat will be retained. So I took the 10-year period of historical sea surface temperature and compared what kind of environment was inside these MPAs based on that historical data. Then I took a 10-year high-resolution run from a single climate model and looked at how much, where is that environment in future. And the metric is how much is retained inside that marine protected area. So you can think of it this way, that in the case on the left, 99% of the areas are retained inside that marine protected area. In the middle, the temperature is shifting a little bit outside that protected area and we're retaining about 2/3. And in the last case there, only 14% of the environment's being retained. So think about that as a shifting, say, temperature distribution, but it could be anything. And so what practically that looks like, here's 4 months at 4 seasons of the year, and here's the outline of the marine protected area, and so the environment that used to be inside there is shifted further south. I could show you a couple more examples that, yeah, environment moves away from the area you think you're protecting. I just can skip that one. And so what that means is that in general, there's very little representation into the future. So the way to read this plot is here's the number of marine protected areas in Australia, and there's about 256 of those. And this axis here shows the similarity. So a whole bunch of them here have absolutely no similarity at all when you look in 50 years into the future. So they're protecting nothing today that will be there in 50 years. And it's not until you come down to this area here, this will be 50% similarity to what it is today. And only whatever the number is, 25 out of 236 will retain 50% of that pelagic environment. Now, if that's what you set them up to do, that's a pretty bad failure rating. The weakness is that I haven't considered, well, that area, when it moves out of one protected area, could go into another one. And so you need to have some idea of looking at that connectivity, which I can't do yet with the data that I have. So in conclusion then, this climate is going to impact on the proportion of habitat and where it is that might need to be covered at both short time scales and long time scales. And dynamic management is going to be an incredibly important tool in our package to address how we're going to continue to do ocean management. It reduces area requirements. That means compliance generally increases because you get fishers or the users of that space more on side. It's good for food security. The reason that we fish in the ocean is to catch fish. That's a process that I hope most of us think is a worthwhile thing continuing. And so it generally just reduces conflicts. And so in general, dynamic management is just one option in shifting climates. And I hope that we'll explore a little bit more about what are the tools and regulations that we need to do to see it more in future. Thanks very much.
I'm Catherine Kilduff, and I work for a nonprofit here in San Francisco that protects endangered species. And I was interested in comparing your presentation to the one we just heard. Do you think that the animals that are in those areas are shifting with the climate changes, or would they stay and adapt? And then my second question is, are the animals that are shifting the ones in need of most protection? So my thought is that some things that are sessile, like corals, you couldn't shift an MPA necessarily on the time scales that you're talking about. Or maybe the animals that can't move are more vulnerable to climate change, so maybe more endangered. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
I think the approach has been tested in pelagic areas where you can look at surface properties, and in the pelagic ocean the things that move a lot are the things we care about. turtles, sharks, seabirds, marine mammals. They are very dynamic and they respond a lot to those conditions. So for those, dynamic protection works really well. In terms of what would happen to, and are most things moving? In the pelagic ocean, most things will move. They're not habitat associated. But at the coasts, we'll have species that move more slowly, but you can still keep up with moving your MPAs very easily with that. They're moving on the scales of 10 kilometres a year or so. And that's a pace that we could definitely work with. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Allstair. An area of interest to me is the interaction of many species with bottom topography features, which are interacting with the water mass. So you have, even in some of the groups that you mentioned, associated seamounts, islands, canyons, which are not moving, while the water masses conditions are moving. In some of those cases, you may isolate the species from spawning areas or other areas. I'd like to have your comments on that.
Yeah, I think the simplest example is turtle nesting beaches. The environment for the turtles might be shifting in the ocean, but the nesting beach is pretty much fixed. Martine's example is things like seamounts in the ocean, where swordfish or sharks are attracted to seamounts. Now, that seamount's not going to move. But what typically happens is that there's a chain of seamounts or a series of those, and in protected area planning, we put the box around one of them and say, therefore, that's sorted. So it might be that the relative importance of those features changes in time, and that would be a reason for moving your protected area there. But there will be definitely things that are kind of habitat fixed, and as the environment moves away, those will be the things that are really challenged. And if you don't move and you don't adapt, local extinction is likely.
Thank you. I'm Paul Hobday. I work here with the Ocean Conservancy in California, where we've worked on creating California's network of marine protected areas. Yep. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the policy appetite for dynamic management of the MPAs. Has this been something that was initially a tough sell? You mentioned there was an appetite as far as fishermen went in terms of being able to follow the dynamic regulations. Yeah. So if you could just expand a little more on that.
We have two different departments in Australia that manage fisheries and conservation issues. The Fisheries Department is very much behind dynamic management. The Conservation Department is not yet aware of how climate change is really going to muck things up for the protected area approach they take. It's a challenge working with them at the moment. We're trying pretty hard on that. Hey, look forward to having a beer with more questions later. Thank you.
Okay, so time for some economics, isn't it? Yeah. Even though Allstair actually had some economics in his presentation, when you were talking of benefits, So that's the title up there, and you've read the abstract, I believe. And like everybody, this is not just my work, it's our group and colleagues, some of them in here. It's a summary of work. So. Two main parts, bad economics and climate change. That's what I hope to go through. And the link between them, actually, I think that is important. There's a link between the two. Yeah, so maybe then I should use this. Okay, good. I'll do that. So I start off with the very basic Gordon-Schaefer model, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have seen this before. This is an example of a model that, even though it's simple and leaves out a lot of details, has a lot of power. You know, those are the kind of models I love, you know. Yeah, you can criticize it to hell, but it's still standing, you know. And if you look at this, there are three key points to look at. For the economist, if you are not here, if you are not running your fisheries such that you are here, it's bad economics because you are leaving this amount of money on the table. You are taking too many boats and therefore wasting all the resource rent or the profit, if you like. So for the economists, that's the point. For most biologists, this will be the point, and that is because you are leaving fish in the water. You are not taking all the sustainable yield, the maximum sustainable yield year in, year out. So there is waste here, but it's a biological waste. This is an economic waste. Now, I don't know who defends this. Some social scientists actually defend this. But essentially, when you are at this point, you are not taking the most fish and you are not getting the most money, and so it's something most of us don't want to do. Now, the question is, how far are we globally from this point that we don't want to be? That is where you have almost free-for-all fishing, right? Where there's open access. So to look at this, me and colleagues, we look at data. We're lucky to find this report, which compiles economic data for 1,000 top fishing companies in the world, commercial fisheries. And these guys are on the market, so they provide this information to help them get investors in the market. So I suspect the data is reasonably a good picture of their economics. So we dug into this data, and I can only quickly give you some of the summary. We looked at pre-tax profits as reported by these companies, and what we see is that there's really very little profit or economic rent being taken. A range of almost nothing to almost nothing, as you can see there. So it's very tightly around zero, which will tell you that these businesses are all just hanging in there, sort of. And that's the main point. And for the economists, when you look at the economics data and you see something like this, it tells you something about the biology also. Overfishing that is going on. We're chasing, using too many boats and people to catch too much fish. So the data actually confirms some overfishing in there. This I call extreme bad economics, in the sense that if you just allow, like I've shown, open access to, okay, there will be waste. But if in addition to that, you use your tax money to give subsidies, you are making it worse. And that's the model again that tells you. So there will be more effort going if you support the fishery with subsidies, especially what we call bad subsidies or capacity enhancing subsidies. So the question is, are we doing this around the world? How much of subsidies are we giving to the fishing sector? And this is our latest estimate of this. We classify subsidies into three main parts: ambiguous. We're not sure whether they will enhance capacity or not. Buyback subsidies are the type. If you do it properly, it may reduce capacity, but if you don't, it can increase capacity or keep it at the same point. The good subsidies are what we call the management and research that helps you to understand your fishery so you can manage it well. We call that good or beneficial. The bad ones are the capacity enhancing, and the typical example is fuel subsidies, 16 billion of them. If you take the total subsidy, that's about a third of the landed value of global fisheries, ocean fisheries, which is around 8 to 5 billion. And this is 27 billion. So a third of your fish on your plate is actually a subsidy. A few years ago, I wrote a paper with the title, "A Fish Called Subsidies," right? So a third of your fish is subsidies. Compounding that problem is IUU fishing, which many of you are aware of. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And this thing we put together, we collected data, all sources we can find between the period 1980 to 2003, and mapped it out. And as you can see, this is happening in many places. There was a time I was showing this, and I said, it happens all over the world. And there was a lady from New Zealand, and she said, "No, Rashid, not in New Zealand." So I don't say that again, right? But I quickly replied to her and said, "Yeah, you may be right, but it may just be because you guys are good at hiding the data, you know." So, yeah. So that is illegal fishing is big, and it's all over the place. And if you ask economists, who say that it's because it pays to do illegal fishing. The monitoring is bad, and when we arrest people fishing illegally, we don't penalize them much. South Africa got so frustrated a few years ago, they had to create a special court to kind of prosecute illegal fishers, because the normal court said, "What has the man done? It's just one fishing, right? They let you go." So that's a big problem, and in economics, illegal fishing is purely an economic activity, as argued by Gary Baker of the Chicago School years ago, and for which he won a Nobel Prize, actually partly. So that is in there. So all of these bad economics, from the ineffective management to subsidies to illegal fishing, leads to what I summarize here in this graph. That's the catch of fish over from 1950 to now, official catch data from the FAO, and that's what you're seeing. So if you look at this closely, it's not peaking as it used to be. So there seems to be some stability there. And the second thing here is the fishing effort. So we are getting about the same fish, but fishing effort is zooming. So we are taking more people out, more boats, burning more fuel, contributing to CO2, right? And climate and all that. And why is this possible? It's all because of the bad economics, I think, or partly, or to a big extent because of the bad economics. We need to stop that. And by overfishing, because of bad economics, we make our systems very vulnerable to climate change and all that comes, and I'm going to touch on that as quickly as possible. So here's a picture. I think you've seen this again and again around the world. This is the average temperature recently versus some time ago. And the more hot the picture, the more the average is higher than what has been the average before. And so there is warming taking place. Sea ice is melting. More acidification is taking place. I just came back from Norway yesterday where we're talking about ocean acidification in the Arctic. So that's a big thing happening out there. And there's less oxygen in many parts of the ocean, and all this together are signaling global changes that are likely to affect fisheries in many ways. And here is a picture just summarizes some of the signs about what is happening. So out here, you have the changes, sea surface temperature and so on happening. They feed into our ecosystem and affect an individual fish or population, community, and the whole ecosystem in various ways. And so if this is happening from the point of view of science, I'm sitting there as an economist shaking my head. If this is going to happen, then there's going to be economic consequences, right? If you're impacting the population this way, it's going to impact your catch and all that you do with the catch. And this is not all talk. This is just a summary of some of the literature that talks about what is actually already happening now for various species, from salmon to cod to the invertebrates that are big in this, in terms of ocean acidification in particular. So it's not all stories. They are happening. It's not just theory. Now, like I was saying, if these things are happening, which I think they are from the science, we know they are, then warming, there are economic consequences. There will be catch changes. In fact, some parts of the world may get more fish. Good for them, right? Norwegians always tell me, we will be happy with a bit more higher temperature, they say. And I say, mind what you're wishing, right? It's not as if the temperature will rise to the optimal for Norway and stay there, huh? It might just zoom. So watch it. So there will be changes in catches with food security implications. The revenue we make, the catch value will be affected. Cost of fishing. I mean, if it's more difficult to find a fish, or they go further away from you, it's going to be more costly. And if you're lucky and the fish come to you, then it will reduce your cost. So all things can happen here. And distribution and management implications are also there. Now, let's be a bit more specific, and this links to Allstair's talk in a way. Imagine you have a system where the fish is actually in that area. So that's your original distribution of fish. And you have all this is happening, warming, all the changes happening. What the science is telling us is that something is going to happen to this distribution. The fish may move higher, and they move towards the poles and deeper into the ocean, running away from the heat, right? We are lucky we can put on air conditioners or heaters, right? The fish don't have that. They have to move if they can, right? So you have this change. And fish may move into that area, and You have invasions, new fish coming in, and extinctions in some areas. So your MPAs, like you said, will be useless, right, if you did it for the original area of the fish. And this, I think, has other big implications in terms of management. And I would just say, imagine you have two countries, Canada and the US, right? If your salmon does this, and they actually do that, that has led to some collapses in the treaty between Canada and the US before. So there are implications, serious ones, in terms of management. And one big example here is, you probably have read this in the news, about mackerel moving away from British waters and closer into Icelandic waters. And they're talking about fish wars a couple of years ago, right? Because Icelandics are catching more mackerel, doubling their quota, while the British are sitting empty, right? This is almost a political problem, a big one. 2 years ago, I think there was a big economics meeting about the ocean in Singapore, and the president of Iceland was there. He gave his talk, and our famous friend, the end of the line guy, what's his name? Who can remember? Our famous friend, the British journalist, Charles Clover, yeah. He was in the audience, and he raised this issue. He said, why are you the Icelandics? Why are you doing this? You know this fish is not yours, and you are catching and doubling your quota. And the Icelandic president laughed characteristically. You know how they laugh Icelandic, he said, yeah, it was very, just went by and said, you know what? You British people have to be realistic. These fish are no more yours, they are ours. So that's the kind of thing you are going to see more of here. So this is serious stuff. Now, on food security, like I said, there are implications here. And the developing countries are really, according to all the predictions, the tropics are going to suffer most because the fish are moving towards the poles. And this is a summary of what is likely to happen, put together by William Chang, one of our young professors, really rising star in this area. He put out a summary of what the literature says. So actually, in the Arctic, there will be more fish moving there because of the thing, but the tropics will actually face less fish. They will have less fish. And to make this more interesting, I put this slide from the Washington Post. Look at this carefully. You see the body mass index of women there and of men here. And if you look at this, really, if you are in this zone, then you have normal weight, right? If you are up here, there's problems. And what this thing tells us, these are the continents. They just took a sample of people in Africa. So the red is the Africans, and they seem to be sitting here a lot. Have you seen that? Red. Asia, sitting here a lot. Yeah. But when you move here, you see us in there, right? See you see here? That's what you see there. So the fish are moving from where we are basically overall we are overfed to where there is malnourishment. And this is a big global issue, I think, that we need to think about, especially if you also remember that these guys are not the ones pumping the CO2 that is causing this, right? So there are ethical and moral reasons in addition to the economic ones. That's my last slide. Conclusions. Bad economy is making global fisheries more vulnerable to climate change. The more we do that, we weaken the system, and if you have another hit, you just go off the cliff. So that is something we need to watch. Climate change is already affecting the conservation, the food security, management, and economics of global fisheries. So this is not something for our children, our grandchildren. It's actually happening. And to start to do something about this, I think we need to end the bad economic management of fisheries. This is one place where the market can actually help the world do a better job, right? By just taking out the bad subsidies, ensuring that if you are caught illegally, fishing is not economically good for you, and the like, actually we move the system to a better place. And we need to reverse global warming. I think mitigation is a tough one, but we have to keep trying to do something about that. And also adaptation has to be part of it because it's already happening. Thank you very much for your attention. for questions.
Hi, Rashid. Thanks. I'm Elizabeth Havis from UNC Chapel Hill. I just had a quick technical question in the beginning. You mentioned you were talking about pre-tax profits, and you used that data to suggest that this was an indicator of open access conditions in fisheries. And so I'm curious, do you see that sort of rent relation that you're talking about with the economic model as being linked to this property relation? Because I think of open access as a property question, and that's so important when we're thinking about how we manage and what these sort of good governance kinds of questions are. So I was wondering if you could illuminate how it is that the the rate of profit is an indicator of open access property conditions. I just wasn't clear on that.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah. Great question, because you see, if I look at economics data, from what I see from the economics data, I can make a link to how good the management is, you know. So this is not about open access in the technical sense. We may be making effort, there may be institutions trying to manage, but what the economics data is saying is that the outcome is just like open access, which means we are not succeeding, essentially. So that is the link. I hope you get it. So is the data talking to me saying, look, they have all these huge institutional arrangements to try to deal with this problem, but it's not working. And in practice, it's as good as open access. So that was the point. Last question,
I know you're talking about economics. So far, I haven't heard anyone speak about the plastics that are in the ocean and the impact on the fish, which we eat, and so that it's a health issue. So I wondered what you have to say about that.
Yeah, okay. You know, when I started working on developing this talk, the first slide I had was actually a picture of all the things, the many things that are happening to the ocean, right? You have plastic is one of them. You have the habitat issues. You have oil spills, all sorts of things happening, even noise, shipping noise. So I had that, and then I was going to build from that, but I thought that might be a red herring, right? Because I don't have time to actually talk about all this. So I focused it and took out that slide. So that's a big issue, and people are looking into that. And one issue that we're worried about with plastic in particular is that, you know, they break up. They break up into little pieces, little shiny pieces in the ocean. And, you know, the fish see this as food, right? So they go eat them, and the consequences, and they sit in their stomach forever, right? That's if the fish lives forever. So there are big issues. There are many other issues I haven't touched, or none of the panelists has actually touched on because of time and focus. Thank you.
So if all the panelists could come up to the table, and we'll actually go until about 12:15, just because we got a late start on the panel. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the questions to the audience and as well as the panelists right away. So please do come down and ask your questions in the microphones. Thanks.
Hi, it's me again. Allstair, I was wondering if, and I should know this from having read your papers, if it's in there, but have you done any quantification in terms of how much of a decrease in the bluefin bycatch, you know, theoretically or, you know, at least modeled that you've seen from doing the dynamic management versus whatever the previous regime was?
Yep. Sorry, what is the signal here when I switch it off? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
No, I don't think
so. So what we do is we divide that area into 3 ocean zones. One of it is where we expect the probability of fish to be 80%. Then there was a different colour I didn't talk about, which was 15%, and then everything else is 5%. And so if that works, you should expect 80% of the catch to come in that 80% area, 15 and 5. Mm-hmm. And from our observer records, we actually hit that almost right on. So our independent, you know, verification of where the catch is really coming reflects that, whether it's both allowed catch or it was not allowed catch. It's coming in those bands. So the management, if it follows it properly, should be getting it right.
Okay, that's great.
Yep.
Cool.
Can I just ask everyone who's asking a question, even if you've asked one before, to state your name first so that they're familiar with who you are?
Well, I haven't asked a question, so I can go ahead and announce myself. Hi. Thanks so much for coming today. My name is Rebecca Martone, and I'm used to be at UBC, but I'm now with the Center for Ocean Solutions. My question is actually to Rashid, and it was about the this idea of economics and how do we reverse this idea of bad economics. And one of the questions is, why haven't we? We've known for a long time that MSY is actually not economically as efficient, so why is it? And it sort of maybe speak to Natalie in that as well, because to me it seems like it might be a social issue as well as an economic one. So if you could just refer to that when you think about solutions for reversing that trend, it'd be great to hear from you. Thanks.
Yeah. I think you touch on the reason. I think a lot of the reason is social. I mean, people want to employ people in fisheries. Many countries use fish as the employer of last resort. So politicians care about jobs, right? So that is one. And another thing is just lobbyists. I mean, it turns out that in many countries, actually the fishing communities tend to have quite a bit of power. And I don't know where that comes from. They just are influential. People don't want to mess with the fishing communities, and that is also one reason for doing this. Yeah.
Do you think it's greater or less than in agriculture? So that's another food production
in terms
system.
of subsidies,
yeah.
Right? Subsidies in agriculture, I believe, are larger than in fisheries. In terms of size, you can compare, but one of the calculations we want to do, we haven't done, is to calculate either per revenue or per employee or worker in fish, because the size of agriculture is just crazy, right, relatively. So.
And maybe to add to that, I think you hit it right on that the fishing community can be a very powerful lobby group. But I think in some cases, fishing is more than just economics too, and people have a cultural association with fishing, especially in the smaller scale fisheries. And that, coupled with the strong lobbying efforts, means that sometimes people have to keep fishing even if it's not profitable because they have to feed themselves. So I think there's a combination of very politically powerful lobby groups that have a big influence, but also this cultural association of what we associate with fishing and what fishermen associate with their activity of fishing.
Yeah, I think climate change is going to disrupt those cultural links as well too. If you're an area that's got a traditional use right or a cultural attachment to a space in the ocean for your harvesting, those fish are going somewhere else. That's going to lead to conflicts between user groups as well.
Yeah, so not failure. Yeah. The management. I mean, it's not just about fishermen, acting aggressively and trying to catch too much. It's also just about failures in basic management.
Yeah, Natalie, your point is a nice addition, But when you look at the data on subsidies, for example, it's actually the big companies that get them. Yeah. It's not the small communities. So you see that part of it. So there's an element of the lobbying being just too powerful.
Thank you. Probably through working internationally, I'm more convinced that bottom-up approaches that involve the community and the stakeholders are very important. This perhaps goes to Natalie, but some of the questions that were before. Stock assessments have grown in complexity in the years that I've been here, from something that could be explained in 10 minutes to something that nobody understands. So you have a room full like this of people with strong interest in the fishery, and some guru is spewing things that one or two people can follow in the audience. So you're told now you have to shut down the fishery 5 months, or you need a marine protected area of 5 million kilometers here. I think that there is a communication failure to include the community in the building up of the solution. I don't know if in Canada they used to have a very nice system years ago. I don't know if you want to share some experiences on that.
Well, Canada is one of the examples of fisheries management failures, unfortunately, especially with the Atlantic cod. But I think you're quite right that it's the community engagement can, especially at these small scales, some of the studies that I was talking about, it tends to be that where people choose to do management of fisheries, where they're able to and where they have the right to or voluntarily can have some sort of effective management, it's always in communities that are very engaged, and it's the community bottom-up effort to do that. But those do tend to happen at small scales, and it's quite a different effort if you're talking about engaging fisheries and fisheries that span ocean basins. Because sometimes there's this big mismatch in scales between being able to engage local efforts and communities versus the actual spatial extent of the fisheries. So I think that's one of the challenges and one of the reasons that we're interested in this question, well, what does work at larger scales? Perhaps you can still do efforts of engaging lots of different communities, but getting them to talk to one another to understand the bigger picture can be very challenging, although with increasing technologies, anything is possible too. And I think maybe we have to think outside of the box of just getting people in the same room to, I don't know, wireless technologies, texting, Twitter, whatever the case might be, to get people talking to one another.
If I can quickly add to that, I think this is about complexity. It's even worse in economics, okay? In economics, it's all been mathematicalized, and this has not much relation to reality, so you are touching on a good point. My main comment regarding your comment is this idea, you know, there is no panacea, as we know. There are situations where engaging stakeholders, which in this case means the fishers, will actually help. They come with knowledge, ecological knowledge, so that I don't deny that. But there are some situations where involving them can actually lead to problems, and we have examples of that. Think of a small community where there is a lot of food security and poverty issues, right? Or even a commercial fishery where people are really in debt and they have to pay their mortgages. Involving them will not help the conservation of the fishery by and large because of these pressures. And I'm not blaming them, but it's good for us to know that. As always, there's no solution, single one.
Hi, I'm Willow Batista again. And I guess I'm wondering, sort of based on what Jane Lubchenco was talking about, being on the side of the decision maker after years of being on the other side. And each of the four of you presented really interesting and innovative research. And Daniel, I think you gave an example of where your work is actually being implemented. I'm wondering if the rest of you could maybe do the same, give some sort of examples of where your research is actually being used in policy, if there are any. Thanks.
Who wants to go?
I should qualify that we're hopeful that they'll use it. We're not actually on it's not a regulation.
The system I talked about has been used for 10 years now, Willow, and that, you know, it's actually implemented. It was successful because it could be done at a sub-policy level. So it didn't need a change of government regulation or anything. The Fisheries Management Agency had that flexibility to do it. So I think it's opportunities for dynamic management that you can do with less oversight by government that are actually going to be pretty successful. The cases where you have to engage a bunch of stakeholders and actually get everybody on side are going to be very tough, and I think that makes it a pretty poor prognosis for US continental waters for actually doing, you know, the kind of management Jane advocates. I think that, you know, slipping in with, you know, sharing the examples of where it is working and we're doing it flexibly, if you can do it at a kind of a sub-policy level is most effective. But, you know, Dan also put up that table that showed examples of where there are move-on rules in place. So I think perhaps one of the outcomes of this meeting might be where we document where there are examples of dynamic management where it is really being used. And over the last 10 years, it's probably gone to, you know, we could think of about between 10 and 15 examples where it's tactically being used now.
And Jane's, Dr. Lubchenco's point about where the incentives are coming from, I think is critical to this, that you know, on a sub-policy level, if you're aligning this type of dynamic management with the incentives of the fishermen, then it shouldn't be that difficult. Yeah. They'll want, you know, hopefully they will want what you're offering them.
Yeah, in terms of my talk, I think I would just pick up illegal fishing, IUU fishing. Since others and myself have been revealing and talking about the economic aspect of this, I think there has been quite a bit of movement internationally to really deal with this. And some countries have strengthened their monitoring, control, and surveillance. South Africa, I told you, had to sensitize the coast by creating a special court for 3 years to make sure people are really penalized when they are caught doing this. So that is, I think, a good example. In fact, last year I was in the U.S. Senate, 4 senators had a whole session. Lubchenco was there actually on IUU fishing. The U.S. government the Senate was taking it serious. 2 Republican and 2 Democratic senators invited this session. So there was bipartisanship because you know what, nobody can go and say I support illegal fishing, right? so it worked very well. Yeah, that's one example. Yeah.
And just to add to that very quickly, I'm working with some of the indigenous groups in British Columbia as well, but there's actually a disconnect between them wanting to implement management and having the jurisdictional authority to do so. And I think you see that when working at a community level in many places where the levels of government that are in charge of different aspects of marine management might not necessarily coincide with the people who are most keen to do actions in the water. So it's an unfortunate mismatch, and I guess if those different levels of government could work together and allow more decision-making influence by the local levels, then perhaps we would be achieving some of our marine conservation efforts quicker than we have been, certainly in Canada.
Hi, I think we agreed I'll go next, thanks. Thank you, it was very thought-provoking. My name is Julia Townsend. I'm formerly with NOAA's National Marine Protected Areas Center in Monterey, and currently a member of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. And this question is about marine protected areas. I actually have one question for the panel and one quick question for Rashid if we have time. The question for the panel is about whether you think there's a mismatch of dynamism, that maybe we don't have models that we've ever seen before in terms of how our protected areas should function. And Allstair, your talk was very thought-provoking in terms of the access and moving things around, but I wonder if we need to change scales. You've got protected areas that were small and now they need to change in size. And do they also need to change in terms of temporality? And so just wanted to ask if we have wanted to throw out any innovative ideas today about how maybe our protected areas need to be changing in nature. And Rashid, I wanted to ask if I'm sure you've thought about this, but in terms of your economic impacts, if you would add to the list trade-offs, because now your opportunity costs are going to change. We think that, let's say the fish move around and the fishermen do too, but they move to an area where you have a wind farm and things that are more static in nature. And so just wanting to ask you about how flexible all of our users really are in terms of opportunity costs. Thanks.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start quickly. One of the cautions I think about dynamic management for marine protected areas is that a lot of the benefit, especially in coastal systems where there's some benthic features associated with MPAs, is that it takes time to build up the habitat structure and benefits and build up the biomass within an area that's protected, often between 5-10 years until you start to see an effect of that protection. So if we were to start to move towards changing these marine protected areas all the time, then you're actually losing that buildup that you're getting. So I think, as Allstair mentioned, what he didn't get to do in his work yet is to consider the network of MPAs and how they might continue to capture the range of species that might be shifting. So rather than only, there's a role for dynamic MPAs, I think, especially for managing pelagic fisheries, either as fisheries closures or as MPAs that actually protect the whole suite of fish within a dynamic pelagic system. But there's still a role for static MPAs because of that buildup of biomass and habitat complexity, I would say.
Yeah. So I agree. Allstair and I have both of our talks in general pertain more to the pelagic side than to the demersal or benthic fisheries, even though mine was specifically on a demersal fishery. And I think it's important to understand that the scale that drives these the pelagic habitats changes, or the drivers for pelagic habitats changes at various scales. So I'm not sure if you're talking about sort of having a scalable set of marine protected areas where you understand the drivers at different levels, and you're trying to sort of make sure that you have each of those integrated into your MPA network or not. But that's an interesting concept that I don't think I've heard of. I think just a second point, it's really important, clearly because it was in my presentation, that we differentiate between adaptive management and dynamic management, because I think simply iteratively changing the location of an MPA once every year or once every 5 years doesn't really meet my definition of dynamic management. I think the point of dynamic management measures is that you don't have to go back and revisit them every 10 years or 5 years to change them, that they are changing with the system that they're meant to be helping manage.
Say something? Yeah, so I want to say something quickly about that. You know, when you were talking, Alice, I was thinking of what it will take to actually do the science, given all the uncertainties that are there, to really be able to track distance and move our MPAs. Just looking at the science and thinking about the politics and the legal, what you need to do to really do this. Yeah. So it took me back to our conference at the Fisheries Center in 1996, not 66, okay? In 1996, and Carl Waters actually came out with an idea, and I was the one who went after him. And he has moved away from that idea, and now I'm attracted to that idea. It's very interesting. And what he said in his presentation was that to protect the fish, we should close the whole world's ocean to fishing. And then you open windows of areas where people can fish. And more, with all that is happening, I'm getting more attracted to this. So it's too dynamic. You cannot do much more than this. So close the whole thing. I would like to find one country that will do this. And they will be smiling in 20, 50 years' time, actually. You close up the whole thing and open windows depending on the best guess of where the action is. So that is to that one. Now, your second question about opportunity cost, I think is a big one. And as far as I know, we are not thinking globally. Most of us are doing our sectoral work. I'm just looking at fish, as if when the fish move there, I can just move there. There might be an oil rig or something, right? So you touch on something which is important, and I think we need to work across the sectors to really understand the opportunity cost properly. It's important.
Eric Young, University of Washington School of Marine Affairs. My question is about catch shares quota systems. Dr. Lubchenco mentioned that the adoption of a catch share system here on the Pacific coast for groundfish has resulted in a dramatic reduction in bycatch. It's improved profitability. My question for each of you is, do you believe that by aligning incentives properly, it assists with the adoption of ecosystem-based management? Does it facilitate that type of a transition? Does it improve the economics? Does it help with dynamic methods of managing fisheries? What is your view? It seems, is it a panacea?
I don't think it's a panacea, but in the specific example I gave in a New England groundfish fishery, without the move to sectors a couple years back, the analysis that I showed you would be useless to them. They wouldn't care for the most part because they just had to throw the catch back. There was no incentive for them for their target species to avoid them in any way. So without the move to sectors and without that incentive, then I think particular management measures that help things like bycatch aren't as effective necessarily. That's not across the board in all fisheries, but there are definitely examples where the move to something like a catch share system helps align incentives for at least bycatch.
I think that property rights are a really important step in correcting overcapacity in fisheries, but I don't think they should be the permanent step. And I think countries like Australia that have gone to ITQs, it helped deal with an overcapacity issue and it helped people take a longer view. But the downsides of ITQ in the long run are that it can lead to consolidation of the quotas in the non-fish groups. And I think with climate change, ITQs will be a dead-end pathway because they restrict people's choices and they restrict their flexibility, and those things are not compatible with what we will need under climate change. So as with, I think they're an important stepping stone for a reason that they can help you economically get things under control. But I think we need to think about what the next solution is beyond that, and particularly as the US thinks that it will now implement catch shares very widely in its fisheries. If it sets them up as the here to 50 years or 80 years solution, I think they'll be fighting them in another 10 or 20 years because they need to be flexible to something else.
Is there some question there with how they're implemented to begin with in terms of the consolidation, but also markets that are available to them in terms of how they can transfer those ITQs? Because would imagine that you might be able to set up markets, Rashid, in some way that would allow you to avoid being constricted to a specific area.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, catchers, I've been thinking a lot about them, you know. And when you look at the three key axes that people are interested in fisheries, is the economics is important, the ecology is even more important, and then the social side. So these are things people care about fish. And if you look at these three, from the data I've seen and all the analysis I've seen, the economics does improve with catchers. That I've seen all over. Now, the ecology is an issue because actually it improves some of the long-term thing, but it doesn't take it all because these fish are so difficult to privatize. That's the main thing. You're still sharing a joint resource. I just have a proportion of it. And so if I go ahead and cheat, I can make more money and everybody will suffer. That element is not completely gone. So the ecology is not like the economics. The social is the one you are touching on. That is, social scientists will kill you, some of them, if you mention ITQs, because you just make 1% rich and 99 not, essentially. And this is a big problem of economics, not just ITQs. So that is what the review of the literature tells me. Actually, I did a paper a few years ago, 2010, called A Cautionary Note on ITQs in Ecology and Society. And to kind of to support Jane, when I came in late, I heard her saying, you have to do this in the midst of a broader set of issues. I heard her talking about ecosystem based. So you have to have things to back up this. It cannot be the only solution.
And maybe just to add to that, I agree with
I reckon with the amount of questions, we ought to roll through them and see if they go through them.
Right, keep moving with the questions until.
Yeah, questions, okay.
So go and then we'll all shut up and do one at a time.
I think you were first. Katie Cito, UC Berkeley. Yeah, my question for you all is about what you think about the role of institutions in all of this. I guess one of the things that I think all of you have touched on is the need for flexibility and adaptability and dynamism in the face of climate change and other drivers that happen on a global or regional scale. But global or regional institutions aren't necessarily known for their flexibility and dynamism. And so I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas about trends in institutions or possible institutions where you see real solutions being made and sort of what scale that exists on.
I mean, the term institutions gets used in many different ways. Some people refer to it simply as the rules in use or the kind of management that's occurring, whereas I think you're talking about it more in the formal context of management agencies as the institutions that do management. I mean, if you look across the world, there are some that are being quite flexible, and maybe Allstair can speak to Australia, which is certainly in its fisheries management, has been trying a lot of these different kinds of management, like spatial management solutions. So I think there's the possibility of being quite flexible in the institutional arrangements, but it can be very hard because the silos of, you know, one agency manages this aspect, another a different aspect, and so on. So the communication across those is really key. But I think some national policies can help to make or require that link to happen so that the multi-institutional collaboration can be much better than it has been.
Just to clarify, I do mean institutions sort of in the general governance sense of like norms and rules and things like that. So down to very, very small HIDA regulations or something like that.
I think on the global scale, you're going to hear some talks tomorrow which may help inform this, or later today from Martine and Eric Gilman that may help inform the flexibility of the sort of larger regional institutions. And there's been a very recent paper out by Ban et al. That looks at those institutions on a global scale and gaps in them as well.
One set of one
we
set
have
of.
Let's go next question.
So okay, next question. Okay. He's the chair now, okay?
Allstair is hungry.
Yeah, good job.
I'll try to be very quick. My name is John Lynham. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii and a visiting professor here at Stanford at the moment. I think there's two themes or two sort of emerging trends, both from Jane's talk and all the panels in terms of fisheries policy in the US and globally, and that's greater adoption of market-based approaches and then greater adoption of spatial approaches. And I think certainly the last three speakers from the panel have given us the impression that in terms of being flexible and adaptive, a spatial approach is better. And going back to Natalie's presentation, one of the thoughts I had is the potential concern with spatial approaches is it might really disenfranchise communities that aren't very mobile in space. And I was wondering if that's something that's been addressed a little in Australia when you have these big, opening and closing of spatial zones.
Yeah. Just quick, in pelagic fisheries, it's no problem. They're wide-ranging anyway. Where it's happening in Australia is with Indigenous communities who want access to harvesting of dugong or turtles, and those resources are shifting, and the communities cannot shift as easily with them. But yeah, I think we're not tackling that in a developed country. It will be in emerging economies where that becomes particularly critical.
You know, a few years ago, I was at a conference in Amsterdam, and this guy was talking about climate change, and he said something like this: what is the problem? If climate change takes down your village, you just move to the next one or move to... And I was sitting in the audience just shaking my head saying, this guy has never applied for visa from a developing country to go to a developed one. And that is why you are touching on. Some people cannot just move. And if their fish goes, they're dead. And that is important. Thank you for bringing up the question. Yeah.
Come on up.
My name is Lida Teneva. I'm a PhD student here at Stanford, and my question focuses on data-poor fisheries, the exploitation of which is very controversial. Basically, we've learned a lot from data-rich fisheries, which have had good fisheries management, and data-rich fisheries that have not had good fisheries management. So what do we do in the meantime while we're gathering all the ecological, biological data in data-poor fisheries? What do we do in the meantime to manage such fisheries, and if you have some specific strategies in mind?
I think all fisheries have data if they have fishermen fishing them, because there's a lot of traditional and local knowledge about what's happening within the systems that are being fished if you ask the people who are fishing there. So I think sometimes we need to think outside of the traditional stock assessment as the only way to do fisheries management, and think more broadly about getting that information from the people who fish the area or those that live nearby that might have seen changes over time. And thus you're able to build in at least some information and come up with some potential solutions for these data-poor fisheries.
I think on the opposite end of that spectrum, you have what Dr. Lubchenco was saying before, and there was also the Managing Our Nation's Fisheries Conference earlier this week in DC, where there was an overarching theme that the data necessary to drive the current methods in developed countries is too much, and that the cost of management due to that is way too much, so that actually you have the developed fisheries actually trying to reduce the amount of data necessary for them to drive their fisheries. Now, what the answers are to that, I think, is still out there, whether they're models that can be used with less data, whether it's buying into the idea that we should be closing large portions of the oceans and only opening little parts to be fished. I think it's still an open question.
For me, I'd say that in the case of data deficiency, you need to take a risk-based approach. If you have a lot of data, you can walk close to the edge of the cliff. If you have little data, you should walk a little bit further back from the edge of the cliff. And if you have no data and it's night time, you should stay a long way back.
She's just
I think this will be our last question.
Okay, my name is Katrina Olimoyo. I'm also a PhD student here. And my question was actually very similar, so I will instead just try to build on that. And I do my work in sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of the data just about fisheries just isn't there. And because, as we've heard, practicing dynamic management really, I think, does require a basic level of data. Are there particular, low-hanging fruit that some countries can grab onto in order to practice dynamic management? And And in regards to there being at least basic data because there are fishermen in these waters, I think one of the additional challenges is that some of that fishing is actually IUU fishing, and so it doesn't actually get to the central statistics offices. So.
You're making me talk about this, okay? So, as you know, there's a big debate on whether you can learn anything from fisheries looking at the catch data, right? Some of you know that. It's a big debate. And some of us in the fisheries science team say, if you don't have stock assessment, you can't say anything about the fishery reasonable. I'm pushing the envelope here. And then there are those of us who say, look here, any fishery you take today in the world, whether there's data or there's no data, stock assessment or not, people wake up and they fish it, right? They don't wait for stock assessment to fish. So why you have to be pragmatic. You have to use the data you have. And if it's catch data alone you have, that is what you use, right? It's not perfect, far from it. In fact, stock assessment is not perfect either, right? These are all, it's a gradient of things, and depending on what you have, that's what you do. That's how we run life, right? In the morning you wake up, whether you are in a village in northern Nigeria or you are in Alaska where you have more data, you do something, right? You go fish. So use the data you have. I think that is the way to deal with this. Right?
I think the progression, though, in terms of getting to dynamic management, if you're starting from a developing country, would be, I don't think you could go to straight the kind of approaches we've shown, but the first thing that might be knocked off is you recognise a temporal closure, say for breeding aggregation, and then the community begins to understand about why a closure has helped in that situation. Then they would recognise actually we only need it for 2 months of the year, or some years it's not there, it's over here. And I think you would see a kind of a development over time of the sophistication of those approaches, but probably starting with a small temporal closure, if it could help the stock, would be the way to go.
And a lot of traditional management is quite dynamic with the sorts of taboos and kinds of closures that you see in many coastal societies. So I think learning from traditional approaches and building those into more national level approaches so that the two align better is another way to enhance dynamic management.
One final point, that the analysis that I showed was heavily data driven, but essentially all it's doing is quantifying what fishermen try to do anyway. So if you talk to any fisherman, they know whether it's because the density of fish in the area that they're targeting has decreased or whether they're trying to get away from bycatch or depredation events, they know they have to move away. So you can, I think there are methods where you can simply sort of go out and interview fishermen to try to understand how they're doing it. And I think there's also the possibility that from the developed fishery analyses, you might be able to come up with generalized rules for different types of taxa.
Great. It's time for lunch, but I want to thank all of our panelists for such wonderful presentations and such an insightful conversation today. I think we've learned a lot, and it's been a great springboard to future conversations both at lunch and in the future panels. So thank you all.
Thank you.